Foot binding is often put forward as one of those sort of cultural characteristics of classical China that is most notable, one of those practices that folks think that voyagers such as Marco Polo should have made note of if they had been to the place. Of course, brushed over in this discussion is the entire global phenomenon of corsets as well, which are contemporaneous with the practice of foot binding when it was most popular in Qing Dynasty China. Corsets were most popular during the same era in Europe, where you have images of a corset from England, and corsets would of course bind a woman's body, making waist look incredibly small. And in one case, you might even have practices encouraging the surgical removal of lower ribs so that corsets could be worn extremely tightly, shrinking a waist down to an incredibly small size, such as in this image in the United States from the turn of the century as well. In this famous turn of the century image from France, depicted by Maurice Leroy, you have a maidservant tightening a lady's corset laces from 1899. This practice of highlighting the corset as a phenomenon that was a marker of upper-class women is entirely brushed over in the later discussions of foot binding in China. Of course, we're talking about the binding of the body here, so quite a parallel conception. Here you see a corset with a newly designed closure from Fashion Illustrations from March of 1831 from Europe, and lacy chemise and bloomers from a seductive postcard titled Corset from 1900 in Europe. We could contrast these portrayals and also point out the similarities by highlighting some of the descriptions of foot binding from European sources and American sources in China, looking at the perceptions of China that were manufactured out of this encounter. For example, from John Francis Davis, The Chinese, from 1836, we have the following quote: "Such shocking mutilation as that produced by the cramping of the foot in early childhood, it may be partly ascribed to the principle which dictates the fashion of long nails. The idea conveyed by these is exemption from labor, and as the small feet make cripples of the woman, it is fair that the idea of gentility which they convey arises from a similar association." Davis goes on to note that the appearance of helplessness which is induced by the mutilation they admire extremely, and the tottering gait of the poor women as they hobble along of the foot they compare to the waving of a willow agitated by the breeze. We may add that this odious custom extends lower down the scale of society than might have been expected from its disabling effect upon those who have to labor for their subsistence. Think about this language. We could almost use this same language to describe the corset, of course. Nonetheless, in European and American accounts of China around the turn of the century, images began to circulate, especially highlighting the practice of foot binding in an extremely visual fashion, even comparing bound feet to unbound feet to show the size. The binding of the feet was described metaphorically as a golden lotus or golden lotuses, and while it was uncommon to do so within China itself, those Europeans and Americans who traveled to China would coax women to show their bound feet for the sake of taking photographs of them. And you begin to see these photographs circulate in the global stage. Now, I do want to highlight here that foot binding, of course, was a very real historical practice. And it was built upon this image that, a small foot, a dainty foot, was a symbol of beauty. And the shoes themselves also were these sort of magnificent works of art, not just handicrafts, but really fine crafts. This being said, the practice of foot binding did irreparable damage to the bones of the foot, sort of crunching them up upon one another, as you can see in these illustrations. Now, just thinking about the practice as it is, how would you compare it to corsets, and why? Go ahead and make a quick post, and then let's move on.